And good evening. This is Deyo, your host. Today is 20 November, Thursday, and the year is 2025, for a bit longer anyway. And tonight, I want to tell you about how small things that you observe in nature can mean a lot. They can teach us a lot about doing greater things with the effects that we've observed. Excuse me, I got this frog from a bit of a cold, I guess, but it's past now. Excuse me. Now, I wrote a paper about part of what I'm going to teach you about tonight. And I'm going to read and show you excerpts from the paper. You can get it if you want to buy a copy of it off our website. It's called The Gemstone Papers, Part 1. And it's on our shopping cart for Standeo, standeo-cart.com, I think it is. It's on our main website. You can click to it anyway. You can read the whole thing and study it at length, but I'm going to give you explanations of these things because they're important for you in your discovery of the world around us. Now, the paper, and let me just get a picture of it here for you. Let's see, where do I share that thing there? And yeah, let me just pause it a second here. Okay. Now, here's the front page. It's a PDF file. You can download it. It's called The Gemstone Papers, Part 1. That's gravity, electricity, and magnetism. And it's a different look at these effects or these occurrences in nature, electricity, and gravity fields and magnetism and all that. They're all unified by various common things that we see. Now, I was taught in school that a electric current from a battery went a certain way, and that way was, like negative to positive. There's always, equations for that, for EMF and power and resistance and all that stuff. Well, this paper that I wrote is exploring the origins of electricity and magnetism as we have been taught, but also what we haven't been taught about what is really going on. Now, in my research at the Library of Congress and various other places, I found a few articles from 1840s, 1842 to be exact, is the one that I chose to discuss in my paper. It's called The Armstrong Experiment of 1844. Now, Armstrong was Lord W.G. Armstrong, and he was a friend of Michael Faraday, Dr. Michael Faraday, the kind of the father of magnetism and DC electricity, as far as understanding it. And it was Faraday's work that encouraged a modern day physicist to generate the equations and stuff that are complex, but to describe what magnetism and electricity really are. And they aren't necessarily needed to be so detailed. They can be explained with pictures and maybe little videos and things. And that's what I'm going to do here is take this example that occurred in the Armstrong experiment of 1842 and go through it with you and see how I discovered the secret to electricity. And it's a lot simpler than the equations that we see nowadays. Let's see here. I'll go to page, whatever it is here, 6 of the Armstrong experiment of 1842. Now I'll just read to you. It's simpler that way so I don't forget anything. Let us begin with the inertial nature of basic electrical phenomenon derived from information which is laying dormant for over 164 years in the form of a paper written by Lord W.G. Armstrong during 1842 concerning his findings in a unique high voltage phenomenon that he discovered. After several years of research, Lord Armstrong had perfected a piece of test equipment which could produce a continuous supply of high voltage direct current electricity. It consisted of an old steam boiler from a locomotive and several especially designed horns or steam nozzles. These nozzles would yield an ample supply of electrons. When steam was forced through them, uh, they made like lightning flashes off of them to the ground. Now, he was able to achieve voltages in the 50,000 volt range, and which would consume or incinerate dry silk threads when passing through them. So, it would be like probably milliamps, but still it was enough to burn silk threads. Now, he had performed many experiments, some of which were electrochemical and others which were electrodynamic. It was during one of these later experiments that a most unusual set of events presented itself to him. He found them so impressive that he immediately wrote a letter to his friend Michael Faraday detailing his findings. Now, Dr. Faraday, in turn, was so impressed that he published Armstrong's letter in the London, Edinburgh, and Dublin Philosophical Magazine and Journal of Science, from which I got this article, the prestigious scientific magazine of the day. Now, an extract from that paper follows, in which the original spellings have been preserved. And to begin his description, 2 wine glasses, N and P, filled nearly to the edge with distilled water and placed about 4/10 of an inch or 10 millimeters from each other, were connected together by a wet silk thread, thread of sufficient length to allow a portion of it to be coiled up in each glass as represented in figure Gem1. Now, I'm going to go over to the where do I share that screen there? I forget. Okay, I'm going to, okay, if I add that to the stage, will that help? Yeah, okay, maybe. Let's try this. And, okay, now here's the page I'm reading from. And he's talking about these 2 wine glasses, N and P. Now I'm just going to scroll down here and show you that, and I'll come back in a minute. Now here's these 2 wine glasses, 4/10 of an inch, 10 millimeters apart. Okay, now he had this 50,000 volt generator coming, from the steam coming to the nozzle in his laboratory there. And he hooked up a wire here to go into this glass of distilled water called N. And then he put this silk thread in there, the red line, which is some coil in the bottom of this one, some coil in the bottom of that one. And then in this P glass, he put a wire at the top touching the water and going to ground so that the electricity could go through the water in this glass, over through the silk thread, and out of this glass to ground. Now, he just bear this in mind here as I talk about it. I'm now going to go back up to what he says thereafter. Okay. Okay. The figure one. The negative wire, or that which communicated with the boiler, was inserted in the glass N, which I shall call the negative glass, and the positive wire, or that wire which communicated with the ground, was placed in glass P, which I shall call the positive glass. The machine then being put in action, the following singular effects presented themselves. First, a slender column of water enclosed the silk thread in its center. This was instantly formed between the 2 glasses, and the silk thread began to move from the negative glass toward the positive one, and was quickly all drawn over and deposited in the positive glass. Now, just looking at the diagram here, there's a silk thread, and this is what happened here. The silk thread was sucked over into the positive glass in that experiment there. Now, he said, okay, and the silk thread was drawn in the positive glass. Sorry. Now, the column of water after this continued for a few seconds, suspended between the glass as before, but without the support of the thread, and when it broke, the electricity passed in sparks between the glasses. When one end of the silk thread was made fast in the negative glass, as you can see below on the page there, the water diminished in the positive glass and increased in the negative one. Let's see. When one end of the water diminished in the positive glass and increased in the negative one, showing apparently that the motion of the thread, when free to move, was in the reverse direction of the current of water. So, in other words, what they're saying here, the positive glass that's over here, when he hooked it up like this, the silk thread went over here and deposited itself there, but the column of water was coming from this glass over to that one, so reducing the water in the positive glass, increasing the negative glass until the channel of water in the air there broke. Now, that's interesting. By scattering some particles of dust upon the surface of water, I soon perceived by their motions that there were two opposite currents passing between the glasses, which, judging from the action upon the silk thread in the center of the column, as well as from other less striking indications, I have concluded to be concentric flows of water, the inner one flowing from negative to positive and the outer one from positive to negative. After many unsuccessful attempts, I succeeded in causing the water to pass between the glasses without the intervention of a thread for a period of several minutes, at the end of which time I could not perceive that any material variation had taken place in the quantity of water contained in either glass. So in other words, this column of water between the glasses, with the thread, the water level changed by going from positive back to negative glass. But without the thread, the water levels didn't change, even though there was two currents, one opposite to the other, going in that water. The amount of each column of water concentric, the other one, did not pass more water than the other column. In other words, the inner column going through that water thread was at, at like a higher velocity, and the silk thread, outside that, the other column going the other way was traveling slower, like, the two were balanced in amount of water, but the time spent transferring them, the speed, in other words, was different. So the one column, this one here, say, without the silk thread here, this column with the white arrows here going that way from the positive glass to the negative, the volume of water in that thread, in that bridge of water, was equal to the volume of water transferred in the inner tube. So that meant that there was a bigger chunk of water being passed in this one than in this one. Let me just see here if I've got a picture of that. Yeah. Looking at this, you can see that the energy going through the water would go out like this and over, and then that same amount of energy, but at a different power, in other words, a different rate of flow, would come back over the outer tube. So that meant that the inner, this one here, this blue one up here at the top, dark blue, that water was transferring at that length in a short period of time. And in that same time, this volume of the outer shell of water here was transferring the same amount of water, but, in, slower transmit. So it was fast here and slow here, but the same amount of water, if that makes sense. Okay. From a purely inertial perspective, several conclusions might be drawn from the experiment. When energized, the negative glass had an energy density greater than the positive glass, as the motion illustrated. So in other words, the electrons in the negative glasses were very, very rapidly moving. Had a lot of energy on the electrons, more energy per electron than over on the positive glass. When this high energy density was led to the positive glass, a stream of water flowed across, transferring high energy density into the lower energy density of the positive glass. And so you can see this happens here. Very interesting experiment, and the results are quite, intuitive in a lot of ways to how electricity works in a DC circuit with wires. Immediately, a return tube of water concentric to the former flowed back across the gap from the positive glass to the negative one. During the transfers, the water levels remained constant when only the water formed the link between the glasses. Yet the water was seen to leave both glasses and move continuously in the opposite polarities glass. The energy was exchanged by moving the molecules of the highly distilled water from one glass to the other. The electrons on the negative side accelerated the water molecules by collision. The molecules then transferred this high kinetic energy and motion to the other side, and hence to the molecules of the lower kinetic energy. These are words, of course, and equations can be made from these words, but the drawings show you what I was talking about. Now, the The interesting way this happens is that I found out that there were like donut shapes or toroids of exchange in that in a conductive wire, which is like that uh, bridge of water between the two glasses. Um, you can see here that in a just a copper wire that you put a negative connection from a battery to one end and a positive to the other, and so you see that it forms motion going toward the molecules and say the positive side of the battery from the negative side. Now, when that happens, you can see here this blue is like the inner tube of water that we were talking about in that bridge, and the outward waves, the returning power, um, you know, uh, was concentric to that donut. There were discrete pulses or tori of power traveling in a wire. But not only did they have curl this way and curl that way, they had twist like this. Yeah. Now let's just go down here. Now I did have to justify what I call the inertial version of electricity rather than just negative positive. And these are the equations that I use to develop that. You can study them at your leisure if you're just a basic physics student, even an algebraic student. You can see what I've said here. And there's no need to go past or in detail over all that, but let's go here. Okay, I say let's go here. Let me just see if I'm in the right place here because I want to tell you about where is the oh gosh, it's called the welders. Okay, it must be here somewhere. The welder's clue. If any of you have ever done any welding with electric arc welder, you would have seen the phenomenon I'm going to talk about here. At this point, I'm just going to have to search for it here. Welder, and see where we are. Yeah, here we are. Okay. Now, here's a thing that happened when I was out at a boat builder's factory. A friend of mine owned there in Fremantle in Australia, and he was welding some aluminum plates onto the skin of a boat he was building. And to my right behind me there was the DC transformer that made the high direct current voltage, but high current voltage, to go through a long insulated cable to his handpiece, which he would then put in a piece of stock, to weld the aluminum plates together. And he would then strike the stock at the joint of a couple of plates. Now, whenever he'd strike it, I heard a slap on the floor behind me and the welder. And I turned around and watched every time he pulled the trigger to put electricity through the stock he's welding with. Dust rose up from the factory floor every time the welder would strike an arc on the stock. And after a few minutes now, I determined the cable from the transformer to the land piece jerked or twisted in such a manner as to strike the floor with force. Close observations would have revealed the wire underwent a sudden twisting torque. I can't get it in the mouth today, around its length. Furthermore, should that power wire have been lying in a loop on the floor, as it frequently does, a loud slap would have been heard as the loop momentarily thumped into the workshop floor. Later, intrigued by the phenomenon, I set out about duplicating it under experimental conditions in my laboratory. Eventually, I reasoned that the twisting effect to be a magnetic one directly related to high power currents of the welding machine. My experiment began with hanging a length of 0.8 of a millimeter wire, diameter across the lab. One end of the wire was wrapped around a plastic anchor peg on the far wall, and that's in this drawing up here above. Here was the battery I was using, and here was this anchor pin here. And okay, let's see. While the other end was similarly wrapped around a plastic anchor post on the wall nearest to the 12-volt battery. So I had this wire, which is the gold-looking thing, um, anchored here to a plastic tack in the wall and over here to a plastic tack. And that wire then came back down the wall and over to the negative terminals of my battery. From the positive terminal, the wire went up to here where the hook was, which completed the the circuit here in this copper wire hanging in the air. Okay, now I just move this up here just a bit. I touched the circuit, you say the negative here, to this negative pole. Before I started the experiment, it was disconnected. Only the plus was connected, and when I connected the negative, it caused the loop of wire, this gold loop of wire, to swing out this way. And if I reverse the current, reverse the wires down here, put this wire over here and that wire over there, it would swing back the other way where the light blue is. So I found that the wire twisted, and depending on which way the electricity was going through it. And this is direct current. Okay. Let's see if there's anything I forgot. Yeah. Okay. If I reverse the polarity to the current flow, the loop deflected toward the wall, labeled C. In either case, as the circuit was closed, the wire deflection was momentarily exaggerated before coming to rest slightly off its unenergized position. Now, what I'm saying there is that, if I hit the plus the minus here to close the circuit and cause the wire to loop out here, it would loop out here and then fall back to a position not exactly where it started, but just hanging off a bit, so that there was an initial surge of torque which twisted the wire out, and then as the torque normalized between go and return of the electrons, it would come to a balance here, where you have the torque balance means the wire was twisted a little bit because the outer motion in the wire, in the outer shell, if you wish, was greater to cause the twist to maintain. It was a differential between the inner core and the outer core twist. Okay. Let's see here. Okay. There's the whole experiment, and I got fancy with a telegraph key and everything like that. And now, in this experiment here, instead of just a straight wire, I hung a loop to let the loops form to all four corners of the magnetic field of the planet. North being probably this way, and south down here, and east and west. Now, when I hit the key on that, all these loops would go sucking, let's say, in at the same time. And then if I reverse the current, they would go out at the same time. I'll just see if I've got a animation of that here that we can see here. I think that'll work. Let's watch. There we go. No matter if I reverse the current, they went that way. And I'll just move this kind of in slow motion here. One way that way, the other way that way, but it was twisting the wires, and that would cause them to deflect in toward the center or out like that. So it was deflection. Now, the other thing I noticed was that I tied paper strips to the single wire so that they hung down when it was in free fall like that. And I found if I made the plus minus connection, that the strips would deflect upward as the wire twisted. To reverse the current, it would twist the other way. I think I may have a shot of that here. Now, here's how it started out. And you'll see when I animate it that this will zoom out and then come back to a rest place, not exactly where it started, until I break the current, and then it'll fall back. So you can see this continuing torque. Now let's have a look at that here. Okay. Now, here's where it starts. Bang. That's when it's horribly unbalanced. One transfer of energy is greater than the other was for a moment. And then as they start to normalize, everything falls back to this rest position here. That's when the full flow is established in both directions and the torques are normalized. Here, when I turn off the power, they go back to rest. So that's the net torque when the two are balanced, twisting that wire. Okay. I think we've seen that one. We've seen this one here. Yeah, okay. Looking at the top of from the ceiling down to the floor, you can see that the twisting in and out occurred this way. One direction, the other direction. Clues, simple things. The Armstrong experiment of 1842 showing a direct current transfer between two glasses, and the water between the two glasses, they were distilled water. The water formed a wire, and he saw that there were two um, directions of flow in that water using the pepper dust and things. And he was able to determine that. Now, that happens in a copper connector, which is what I was showing. Um, let's see. Welders would be familiar with the phenomenon, which gives yet another clue to the transfer of this electricity. When a weld is laid down along the surface of the stock to be welded, a circular or swirled pattern forms in the molten electrode as it is laid down. This effect was described in an article appearing in the New Scientist magazine. Quote, at high currents, however, the end of the wire melts and begins to rotate at about 200 revs per second. The plasma stream picks up the liquid metal and rains it in a spiral onto the weld surface. This effect can fit quite nicely into the two-tube hypothesis of direct electric current transfers, as I've discussed. The center of the weld swirl would exhibit signs of a contraspin tube, which would partially offset the torque of the outer tube carrying the metal. The swirl pattern left in the weld closely resembles the cut tracks a tornado leaves on the ground as it moves. And let's just look at this here. I think by this time you understand that these two flows, that they form a spiral, and then a back spiral around that one. Return torque and the outer tube flow, and you can see here. Okay. Now the existence of the twisting moment itself was a mystery. After analyzing the Armstrong experiment in great detail, I thought the exchanges of energy were in tubes of water flowing in straight lines between the glasses. So you can understand my curiosity when I observed the twisting wire phenomenon. At first, I considered the momentary torque on the wire was due to a magnetic moment created along the conductor as some unknown byproduct of a Lenz's law. However, I remember the torque effect only lasted for a fraction of a second before coming back to an almost zero deflection. If it were a function of Lenz's law, then the deflection from the torque should be a constant as long as the power is applied to the circuit, not for a fraction of a second. Even if I could somehow attribute the momentary twisting to the magnetic field of a current or even the thermal effects, I would not have to explain why. I would have to explain why the phenomenon has a right-handedness, or more correctly, a same-handedness as the polarity dictates. A growing college of researchers is investigating the twisting moment found in nanotubes. Researchers like C.L. Klein and his like attribute the twisting of the conductor to what they call twist-ons, yet they do not explain the cause of the right or left-handedness of the electron flow in the effect. The same-handedness effect is accepted as axiomatic without further explanation. My test showed that the twist occurred to the same side for a given circuit's polarity. No matter what the orientation of the wire was in 3D space, it was a phenomenon inside the wire. This suggested the causal phenomenon was not the Earth's magnetic field. The effect had to be from events in the wire itself. The answer had to lie in the atomic lattice of the conductor. It has fairly well been proven that Joule heating in a wire is due to the amount of unaligned or non-lattice atoms within the wire. An electric impulse wave travels rapidly and almost without loss along a perfect lattice. But when it encounters atoms that are not bound in the lattice, it is slowed down and heat is released as a result of traversing the region of chaotic or unaligned atoms. Now, cooling a conductor lowers its resistance to current flow. When the temperature nears absolute zero, many conductors even become superconductive and as such offer no resistance at all to the passage of an electric impulse wave or to the traversing electrons. In an ether-filled universe, as I postulate in this paper, where vectored energy exchanges create effects of gravity, electricity, and magnetism, one has to examine the same-handed twist as a result of two or possibly more vectors at an atomic level. In part 2 of this paper, I will discuss the vector interactions that create gravity. But for now, I must ask the reader to accept the statements that I'm about to make. From the motions of galactic clusters to that of atoms, spin, and about an axis, it is evident that, in my contention, the spinning masses of any system spin in concert with the spin vector of the parent or genesis system. However, I'll explain that in the following sections of the paper. Now, yeah, okay, so let's see. The solution to the enigma um, seems to be a group of atoms who always spin in the same direction about their axes, which are perpendicular to the surface of the Earth. This means no matter which way the wire is turned, its atoms are spinning in such a direction as to create the polarized torque effect. This would be possible if the nuclei were always stable and spinning at right angles to the Earth's magnetic surface, but the outer shells of the electrons were oriented to the shape of the wire and did not change their spin axes when the wire moved. For this to be a circumstance, all atoms on the Earth would have to have their nuclei aligned relative to the local genesis vector or the spin of the Earth. This would explain the same-handedness of the twist. Let me just stop this here. Okay, remove that and go back to Stanley here. I put the text up there so you can turn off the audio and read what I was reading because I might have read too fast, letting you think about it, whatever. But the fact that every atom on the Earth, in the Earth's surface and down to the core, is aligned to the gravitational field of the Earth. That means that they all have a certain spin core in an atom, and then even the electrons, that is at a certain angle to the Earth's gravitational field. Now, I did an experiment a few years back after I'd written this paper, and I got a bunch of people in the southern hemisphere and in the northern hemisphere to run a test with a straight wire up and down, in the room here, in the top part of the wire, you went to a plus side of a battery and the negative wire on the bottom one so we could see the twist. To see if the twist was in the same direction in the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere, which was quite interesting, quite illuminating, because they reacted to two different angles of spin and the gravity of the Earth, which you don't understand yet because I haven't explained gravity and how it works. But I promise you what you're going to find in the paper that I'm writing on gravity is that there is no gravity or attraction to an object without spin in that object, forming a vortexual spin. Every atom, every subatomic particle has a spin of some sort, and thus local gravity to it if it has mass. And that gravity itself is not a one-directional force. Since I'm talking about spin of fluid, space fluid, the spin can be violent enough that it causes standing waves between the center of the spin and free space out here. The faster it spins, the more rings it makes, standing wave patterns, because the spin out into fluid of space reflects back from the fluid of space, and they overlap, forming stable, like orbits, if you wish, or like rings. They balance each other and make what's called a standing wave. Now, I can extrapolate that to the orbits of planets in a star system like ours. There's a simple formula that I put together showing that the sun is spun by the spin of space, and that stable or standing wave patterns form orbits all the way out. And not all of these orbits are occupied, but they are orbits that when a mass is trapped in them, that the divergent, convergent waves form a hollow tube like that, which traps the planet in it. Velikovsky wrote about something in records he looked at in the myth and lore of ancient civilizations, and they talked about a planet that moved in the sky and jumped in to where it is now, which is Venus. And Venus itself seems to have been kicked out of a stable orbit by something. And when it landed where it is now, one planet away from the sun, instead of spinning in the direction of orbit, it spins backwards. But it's slowly slowing down to get in touch with the fields that form its tube there. But it was transported from another stable orbit by an impact. Something came into the solar system and kicked it out. Okay, let's look at this. Okay, I'm now going to get over here and share this here. Okay, this is from that same paper, page 30 and 31. Now, these are the experiments that were done northern and southern hemisphere. So when the wire twisted, I had like a little mirror that had people put on a little reflective foil and a laser, so that the laser shone on the foil, which then put a dot on the wall. Now then, this will show you that in the Northern Hemisphere, here was the result we got from setting this up in our garages. So by making and breaking contact over here on this battery here, watch that, I made contact, it deflects to the right on the screen. Break contact, it comes back. This is the way it occurred in the Northern Hemisphere, from center to right. Now then, let's look at this page here. We've got another one from the Southern Hemisphere. And we look at here is, instead of being from the center out, it's from the out in. So it was opposite to what we saw in the Northern Hemisphere. The twist in the wire reacted opposite to what it did in the Northern Hemisphere, which tells you that it's interacting with either the magnetic field or the gravitational field of the Earth. And in my opinion, it's the gravitational pull, where the atoms are all, subject to gravitational alignment, which would be, opposite in each hemisphere, obviously. Just looking at this again, now this is the Southern Hemisphere. We have it connected, the laser's on the wall, and we disconnect it, and the laser falls back to the center point, and then we connect here. Then we switch, and it comes back. All right, let's look at this one up here again. Here we start. Okay, now I want to show you some high voltage experiments that I did with the Van de Graaff generator that produced some interesting effects. This is producing 250,000 volts shooting up into the air, and I studied it. I'm going to show you that here. I'm going to put that in here. Let's see how we do that. Okay. Now, I had this copper cone made to fit on top of my Van de Graaff generator so that the high voltage electrons gathered on this cone would accelerate their force toward a central point here. And I put some clay, modeling clay, or plasticine, they call it in Australia, to hold this 3/4 inch, I think it was, steel ball right here on the top. And it produced this visible purple funnel up above it in the coronal discharge. And so I I took a piece of paper and wound it into a cylinder. And in some versions of the cylinder, I put little wingtips, and others I drew carbon pencil lines in spirals around them. But what I managed to do was to float that cylinder in the air, and it spun like crazy, but hung in the air until I turned off the power. And it was because the tube that I selected had, let's see if I've got it down here. Don't know whether I did or not. No, the tube had two things going for it. One was the diameter was such that the smaller one I did by experiment, that the electrons coming off of this ball would go through the tube and would push it up. But then the electrons that would come back on the outer side of the paper tube, going the other way to form a circuit in the air, would cause the tube to float by balancing the forces from the bottom and the return electrons from the air. Let's see here. Okay, two tubes. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, now let's see. A few days later, copper cone replaced that. Okay, and okay, a few. Okay, now this is important again to show the two-tube theory of electron transfer, one going and one coming, and you can balance them in the shape of this object, causing it to float that way. I could stand across the room from this about 25, 30 feet while it was floating in the air, and I could put my hand on a heat radiator in the room that was grounded, and on my right hand I had a steel screwdriver, and I would point the screwdriver at the Van de Graaff generator was floating the particles in the air, and I would touch my finger to the steel blade of the screwdriver, and everything would collapse over there. Or I could make it dance up and down if I did it quick enough, showing that the field was so connected to me 25 feet away that I could affect the spin rate and the force of the whole coronal discharge. Quite an interesting experiment to do at home, anyway. Okay. The cone did spin. I found it was doing about 400 RPM around the vertical axis. You can see that in the paper. Okay. When then performed numerous tests with smoke to observe change air motions within the various geometries we constructed. Oddly enough, we frequently found that the air currents in the tube spiraled slowly about the vertical axes. This is attributed to a conservation of momentum when the various linear vectors of the emitting electrons met with the air molecules of lower velocity and larger masses. Let's see. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Now this led to a study of another kind of, innocuous type thing, a tornado. Now, tornadoes are like electric current DC discharges, some coming from the funnel down to earth and others returning back up around the inner thing. So it's like a conductive wire, except that it's in a moist air from this cloud to ground. Now, people always thought that a tornado sucked things up the center like this, suck from down here and up to there, but that's not the way it happens. The warm air coming down, which it is, it's warm air, charged air comes down, hits the ground and creates a little bit of a kerfuffle down there, confusion at the bottom, and then the air comes back up the outside. Now, these things have spin, and the vacuum forms on the outer edge of the funnel, and that's where pieces of stuff are caught in that spin and shuffled up like this. They don't just go in and up like that. They go up and circle around the inner tube and then fall back to ground. Okay, let's see here. Let's look at it. And this is the same as with Armstrong. Vacuum is at right angles to the returning airflow, which is slower moving than the central core. It goes down, hits the ground, and is confused as it forms its way back up into the outer shell to complete the circuit. Okay, warm, moist air down in the red line, cool, dry air up on the outside, and that's where the vacuum occurs, is at right angles to this, turning in a spiral going up like this. Observe a tornado in the future, and watch the things that get sucked into it. They get sucked to the outside and spun around. There was a farmer. I want to see if I put that story in here, but let's see. Yeah. Okay. Okay. We saw that. Okay. Let me just see if I can find that story. If not, I'll tell it to you. Just give me a second here. Now, we were looking at that diagram there of the tornado, the two tubes. It reminded me of a story which I thought I had in here, but I'll tell you because I didn't put it in this paper. In something like a Reader's Digest years ago, I read a story about a farmer out on his property, a wheat farmer, and he was caught out away from any place to get to safety when a tornado came toward his property, and the funnel lifted up instead of coming at him. It lifted up in the air and then dropped down on him, and he thought he was a goner. But what happened was he felt a warm, moist air shower in the center of the tornado that was all around him. And he was, amazed by this. He thought, well, I don't know why I'm still alive, but there was a warm air flow down, like in the center of a tornado wire, like I was showing you. And then the tornado funnel lifted up off of him and went somewhere else instead of moving through him. And as a result, he survived and was able to tell us that, hey, tornadoes, the center of them is the suction. In the center of them is hot, warm air coming down. On the outside is where the vacuum is. Interesting things, little things that you notice in life that are important to understanding the physics of the universe we live in. I mean, it can give us the secret of how direct current flows, how it twists things, in wires, in creating galaxies, in gravity. But just from that one simple little effect, and then say the Armstrong experiment, you start to get a different picture of how things work. A very important picture. Okay, now just to review in picture form what we've been discussing about direct current flow, there are actually two flows of energy, one high density, one low density. And I'm going to share the, let's remove that and let's add, no, let's do that. We want to find a share button. I knew that. It's an image file from our, no, okay, I knew that. Just a second here, folks. Cancel that. And stop share. And then share a screen. And we want to share our Photoshop screen. Here we go. Okay, and put that up on the stage. Take me off of the stage. Okay. Now, the first thing we showed was the Armstrong experiment with the silk thread and the water encapsulating it back and forth, showing that in a direct current flow, in this example, it's in one direction in net, but in essence, there are two flows, normalizing the energy on the atoms in this glass with that one. And the next thing we looked at here was the traversing of a wire that formed in toroids, or like this shape, the blue being the inner direction, the tan being the outer direction, transverse toroidal wave. Okay, and then we discussed tornadoes, the warm downdraft, things like that. And then we discussed more detail of that, showing that the vacuum is at right angles to the outer flow. And here we discussed the twist in a single wire, which I hung from the ceiling and pulsed DC currents into, back and forth by reversing the electrodes here. And it showed that the wire would twist in free space like that, depending on which voltage was going through what direction. And then I hung that wire instead of straight across the stage, the room. I hung the wire into the four corners of the room, making this loop here being toward the north and the south and west and east like this, and showing that if I touched that current like that these wires would either go in toward the center or out away from the center. It was in that animation that I showed there. And this showed like a paper strip test of that single wire, where I cut paper strips and glued them on to this wire so that they were all hanging down straight like this, until I put the key, close the key here to make electric current go through it. And then I could watch the twist in the wire move along the wire as the paper strips were twisted like this. Kind of cool it was, yeah. And then we discussed the return torque and the forward torque, inner flow and outer flow returning. And the net of those two torques is what twists the wire to its resting place. As the torque is forming, the wire twists, vastly, quickly, and a lot. And as the field establishes with the flow between this side and that side returning, or this tube and that tube returning, when that flow normalizes, and the torque is a net which is much lower than the motivating torque, you have a static torque after things have normalized in the wire flow. Okay. Now, you've seen this discussion of the analysis of the Armstrong experiment, the tornado experiment, or analysis, and then you've seen my test with a straight wire in the loops. Now, these are from observing a couple of simple things that I went to great detail and try to figure out why they happen. One of the main ones was, of course, the welder's clue with his handpiece wire going back to the power generator, to transformer, that it would slap the floor every time he pulled the switch to turn it on to do the weld. And I thought that was really interesting, and I thought about it over a few beers and discussions with people, and eventually that led me to realize what I've been telling you. There's two torques involved in a direct current transfer, and you had two fluids. And then I started looking up things and found the Armstrong experiment. I was just analyzing a simple thing that I saw in nature and trying to explain it. And then I went to like tornadoes. I thought, are they like a wire? And you could see that the tornadoes functioned that way, that there was a downflow of warm air this way and a cooler airflow coming back up in the opposite spin. As I said, I was looking at simple things, trying to explain them. Torque in a wire, torque in a welder's wire, twist and vacuums forming in a tornado. And then I even found out that these were dependent upon the northern and southern hemisphere alignment of atoms. Another just a conclusion drawn from analyzing results, looking at and trying to explain a simple phenomenon. Now, in the future, next broadcast or more, I'm going to talk about another simple observation that led to a rather extraordinary discovery. The job of watering the flowers and the bushes in my yard back in Melbourne, back in Mesquite, in Dallas area there, fell to me. Several times a week. I'd have to go outside the house with a water hose and water the plants because we didn't have a reticulated garden at that point in time. We just had hoses, sprinklers. And I remember being bored this one particular time, and I needed to entertain myself a bit, and so I pushed the hose, closer on kind of a spray nozzle. I pushed it closer into the mud and sand underneath the bushes, and noticed that it created a turbulent flow down there. And so I took the hose back from the handle about a foot, and I then touched the nozzle down to the dirt and sand, and it sucked it in instead of splattering it everywhere. It sucked it in, and trying to figure that out was what I will talk about later and show you the devices I built and tested with that. It was showing that you could have a stream of water coming out of that hose in one direction, thrusting back like this, and it would be sucked forward into the ground once you put it where the water was in the ground. So then I remember I went out and I got about a 2 or 3 gallon bucket, and I filled it up with water, and I did the same thing with this hose. I held it back about 12 inches from the nozzle and had it on direct spray, like a spray, not fanned out, but a real solid stream coming out. And then I put that over the barrel or over the jug, or the 3/4 jug, 3/4 3 gallon jug is what it was. Anyway, and I put it over the top, and just before I touched the top of the water with the nozzle, it was kicking back like this. It's like a rocket shooting out stuff behind it to go this way. So when I just touched it to the water surface, it reversed. It sucked it down in like gangbusters to the bottom. And I then tried to figure out what was causing that. And that was a simple observation that I needed to understand how it worked, why it worked, which would then, as I'll talk about later, led me into a most remarkable concept of propulsion, but backwards propulsion. Instead of action, reaction, I would have action, action. I would be able to thrust forward in a medium and go chasing that thrust rather than going the opposite direction. Sounds counterintuitive, but a little trip in the garden there, getting bored with the watering, led me to look at this, what's called entrainment asymmetric propulsion. And I designed a number of flying saucers based on a fan and a flow of air or water. I did marine versions too. And so that using that, I could save energy and recoup part of the drag energy that is pulled through the water or the air, and put it back into my prime mover and reduce the cost and fuel of traveling from point A to point B. It's also a way that we can have a warp to space if we use some of the principles I've showed you here to design a gravitational type propulsion field, which opens up a space ahead of you and closes it behind you as you move through space. And so the conclusion will be that we now have a way to build a warp drive and propel it faster through that warp drive to propel it through space at much greater speeds than the current speed of light. And that's simply because we get around pushing through space, but create a curl through space behind us. The faster we go, the more we can go, and the faster we can go. Fascinating concepts. But again, it's observing everyday events that occur around you and saying, why? What is that effect caused by? And can we adapt it to other processes? And that's the joy of invention. Um, what we've talked about here is inventing, you know, uh, electric fields that twist things. In essence, there's a way to make us just like a straight wire, lay it across two bars, negative and positive, and have that bar go rolling along as the current twists it. I don't know if I've got a picture of that. I'll see if I've got that. I'll show you before I close. Okay, now here's what I've got. A drawing of some of these torque features of a straight wire. Now suppose that we set up here a battery and a resistive coil here to balance the load so we don't burn it out. And we run electricity from the battery on the negative side over to a conductive post with a bearing in it like this, and a straight wire going across like this to there to another bearing surface and out and around to the battery. Now, imagine, if you will, if you took this conductive bar, which is like a wire, but a conductive bar out of those things and stretched it across these two leads here without these bearings to let it spin. Put it, laid it just across a long straight section of these two wires and got rid of all this over here. This wire or cable or whatever conductive bar you've got here would start to roll in one direction or the other across these wires when you made contact, because it would go up and through the bar and cause the torque. It would start out quick and then slow to a kind of a norm speed as it moved along these wires. So just an interesting school project. You could do it this way, or have these straight conducting wires out like this, lay this conducting bar across them, close their circuit, and watch the wire go scooting along like that without any bearings or anything like that. Just a thought. Okay, guys, I've probably stumbled through enough of this for you tonight. I'm going to sign out here, and I appreciate your time and patience. I'm a bit tired. I've been taking cough medicine stuff, which makes me a bit groggy, so I apologize. Okay, I'm gone now.